industry and a trip down memory lane and what worked over the years and how it's changed and what we're dealing with now, which is something we never thought we'd see. Yeah, we'll start at the beginning. Jarrett talked about, I went to UC Davis and studied winemaking and brewing science. And this was in the early 1980s. And I graduated in 1984. And back then, craft brewing really wasn't that big of a thing. Sierra Nevada was out there, Anchor was out there, but most of the graduates of the UC Davis Brewing Science program went on to careers at Anheuser-Busch. And we took a field trip up to Sierra Nevada in 1984. And this was when Sierra Nevada had a 10-barrel system. They were brewing, fermenting in open fermenters that were scavenged from the dairy industry. And they were making the hoppiest beers I'd ever tried in my life. And it was incredible. And that was really what kind of convinced me to really focus on brewing. And unfortunately, when I graduated, there weren't any jobs available except with big brewers, and even they weren't hiring. It was in the middle of a recession. And I ended up getting a job in the wine business, which turned out to be a blessing in disguise because when I worked in the wine business, I was moved to a small town on the central coast of California. And in 1988, there was a gentleman there who was starting a pub brewery in the town I was at. And I was able to join with him and get started in the brewing business. And then the rest is what's happened, and it's been almost 38 years now. This summer, it'll be 38 years. So it's been a long time. It's fun to reminisce. So bear with me as I talk about some of my experiences in craft beer. So I want to start off with the early days. I'm from the San Francisco Bay Area. That's where I grew up, and that's where my first exposure to craft beer was. This was in the mid 1980s. This is when it really started to become a thing, and there was not much happening. It was very sporadic. But in the Bay Area, there were some things happening in Denver and New England and Washington State, and then the Bay Area was a big part of the origins of craft beer. But it was great. There was Bill Owens. I put a quote up there from Bill Owens. He owned a brew pub. I think it was the first brew pub in the country, but it was called Buffalo Bill's Brewery in Hayward, California, which is near Oakland. And he was out there saying there's going to be a brew pub in every town at some point, and he wasn't far off the mark. This was a time when people were not familiar with good beer or flavored full beer. The big brewers owned 90% of the entire beer market. So the top 10 brewers in the country had 90% of all the beer production in the United States. And I don't know how many of you were around when that was happening, but when you went to a grocery store or a liquor store or wherever you could buy beer, if you found imports, you were doing well. And there really wasn't a heck of a lot of things to do to really support good beer. And a couple of things that were going on at that time, most of the brewers that were starting out, their customers were very curious. So if you built the brewery and you got the word out that you had a brewery that was making, handcrafted beer or whatever you wanted to call it, microbrew, whatever, you could really bring people in and educate them on what beer was beyond the American lager beer style. And, these are people it was a very counterculture movement at the time. A lot of the people that were starting breweries were old hippies. It later became kind of a punk movement. But, I think in the early 80s, it was more counterculture. These were people that were looking to stick it to the man, and California was one of those states where they had self-distribution. So, if you were a brewer, you could brew beer and you could deliver kegs to restaurants and places that were interested in your beer. So that was a big part of it. But, back then there weren't ingredient suppliers out there. You couldn't get a wide range of yeast or malts or hops. You had to kind of get what you could get. A lot of it came through homebrew shops, right? Because homebrewing was legalized in 1978, and that's where most people kind of got their start. And I'll talk about that in a second. But, all these brewers, there weren't that many of them. They all rallied together. The camaraderie in the business started at the beginning. And, everybody was fighting against industrial beer, fighting against homogenization of beer flavor. Canned beer was evil, pasteurization was evil, preservatives was evil, non-natural ingredients, all that stuff was bad. And so they were able to market their products as being natural, homemade, this is real beer kind of thing. And it was a really special time. And it's interesting, most of these small breweries that opened up didn't really put much thought into their food. A lot of places opened up as brew pubs, but if they were a brew pub, they probably had a couple of sandwiches and maybe some chili or something. And really that didn't really start taking off until Gordon Biersch opened up in 1988. And Gordon Biersch was the first brew pub that I ever saw that had good food, that put equal focus on their food as their beer. And Gordon Biersch was really groundbreaking back at that time. But, you couldn't get hop pellets, and you didn't want hop pellets. Back in the 80s, hop pellets were not what they are today. They weren't very good. They were, the hop suppliers have gotten so much better at making pellets over the past 25 years. But back then, if you used pellets in your beer, you were going to get kind of grassy flavors that you didn't really want. So everybody was using cone hops, and you could get quarter bales, and you could get 10-pound bags from your homebrew shop and things like that. But most professional brewers started off as home brewers, and I think that's still the case. If you look at the professional brewing industry, probably 80% of the people that started breweries were home brewers. So it's a very important part of the community. Here's some images from some of the early days, and I show this just because I think it's kind of fun. But obviously on the left, that's Fritz Maytag from Anchor, who, when I was in the Bay Area, everybody was like this to Fritz Maytag, right? And you had probably 20 pub brewers, craft brewers in the United States, and if Fritz Maytag ever talked to you, it was something amazing. And their brewery was gorgeous in San Francisco. It had copper kettles and the open fermentations and tile floors, everything that any small brewery back in the 1980s would just be able to dream about at best. The second set of pictures there, that's Jack McAuliffe and the new Albion Brewery. They started in Sonoma in the late 1970s and closed a few years later, but really he was the guy who most people thought really started craft brewing or microbrewing. And he kind of went into seclusion after his brewery closed, and then Sam Adams and some other people brought him back and started brewing his beers and started celebrating his legacy, which was great until he passed away a few years ago. Sierra Nevada Brewing Company, that was the first craft brewery I ever went to. Back then they had porter, stout, and pale ale, and that was it. And it's interesting, the breweries back then weren't into beer styles like we are now. And so most of the breweries that opened up, they had a pale, they had an amber, and they had a dark beer. And Sierra Nevada had a pale and kind of an amber beer and two dark beers. Sam Adams, of course. Burt Grant's was the first brewery, one of the first brew pubs in the country in Yakima, Washington. Burt Grant was a hop chemist, worked in the hop industry for years, started this brewery, made incredibly hoppy, incredibly bitter beers. He was the first craft brewer to use the term India Pale Ale for one of his beers in the mid-1980s. So up until then, even though Liberty Ale, Celebration Ale were being brewed, Anchor and Sierra Nevada weren't calling them India Pale Ale. So he was the first one to actually put that label on his beer. Talked about Buffalo Bill. His claim to fame was brewing a beer called Alimony Ale, and he called it the bitterest beer in America. We were having fun back then too. And then Pete's Wicked Ale. How many ever had the original Pete's? Yeah. So I'll tell you this. I got to brew a beer with Pete 2 weeks ago in Georgia. He came out for a cask ale festival that we had, and there's a home brewer, a guy who won Beer Drinker of the Year. His name is Phil Farrell, who started a brewery called Stillfire Brewery in Georgia 6-7 years ago. And he said, let's do a collaboration. Let's see if we can get Pete involved. And Pete, of course, said, yeah. And I've known Pete since the 1980s, but this is the first time we really kind of brewed together. And we brewed a version of the brown ale, and we used, instead of Golding's hops, which I think he used back in the 80s, we used Citra in it. And I got to try it last week. It got released when Stillfire opened up a new facility, and it was absolutely marvelous. So that was a lot of fun for me. Back then we were all home brewers, right? And there weren't that many books out there. The one book I didn't put in this picture was The Complete Joy of Home Brewing, which I should have put in here because that was one of the first books. But, it's interesting because most of the literature that was available to brewers at this time was all English style ales, because England had a big home brewing scene before it was legalized in the United States. So most of those beers are English, and that's one of a few reasons that most of the brewers who started off in the 80s started off brewing English styles. So it's, there's a lot of things that led to that. Lager brewing was complicated. It took a lot of time. It took a lot of tank space, blah, 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 blah. But most breweries started off brewing English style ales. Nobody knew what the heck a Belgian beer was back then, and some of these other styles that have come and gone, it's really, it was really difficult to even fathom the wild range of beer styles that are available now. So this is my background. So I studied at UC Davis. That picture there on the left is Dr. Michael Lewis, who mentored so many brewers over the years. And he was the head guy at UC Davis from the 1960s until about, I think about the mid 1990s when Charlie Bamforth took over. But he was amazing, and he would tell you himself he was one of the biggest bastards in the world. He didn't want you. He was very intimidating, and he'd be very, very blunt with his criticism of your work. But he was also very honest, and he was a great professor, and he knew a lot about brewing. But again, he was from Wales. And he had a relationship with Anheuser-Busch. So most of the people that went through the Anheuser-Busch program learned how to brew English styles, and they learned how to brew Anheuser-Busch American lagers. And craft really wasn't a thing, although he did some consulting work with some small craft breweries that were trying to get started in the early 1980s. My first job was at a brewery in Hollister, California called San Andreas. And I was working in the wine business it's near Monterey, California. I was working in a winery there. And this guy was starting a brew pub, and there was an article about him in the local newspaper. So I looked up his phone number in the phone book, and I called him. And I said, hey, I'd love to talk to you about what you're doing, because I still had eyes on being in the brewing industry, and that's what I wanted to do. And he ended up hiring me as his brewer. And then shortly after that, he got fired from his job at the tomato cannery because he was starting a brewery. So he ended up having to go to the brewery full time. So I only worked there part-time, but I did it for 4 years. I brewed beer. I made up all his recipes for him. I brewed once a week for him and came in when I could to help package and do everything else in the brewery. So it was a lot of fun. I didn't make any money at all, but we did a lot of fun beers. Everything was earthquake themed. Hollister, California is known as the earthquake capital of the world. 2 of the biggest faults in California run right through the center of Hollister, so they get a lot of small earthquakes there. But we did a lot of fun stuff. We did the very first apricot ale I think anybody had ever brewed, long before Pyramid did theirs. We did a sour cherry ale. We did an imperial stout, and then most of it was English inspired. 4% or so, because he wanted the English pub experience. He wanted people to come in and be able to have several pints in an evening and enjoy themselves and talk. And so that whole thing was really great. Again, this is what you saw when you went into a brew pub in California in the mid 1980s. You got a gold, an amber, and a dark. So things have changed a lot. Here's some other pictures from the early days. Early beer festival, Golden Gate kegs, which is what everybody used back then because the big breweries were getting rid of them. They were easy to fill. And then you just bung them up. You could just fill through a hose through the top, close it up, bung it up. You didn't need any fancy keg cleaners or fillers or anything like that. Everybody also used, instead of slim kegs, they used corny kegs, which you're all familiar with, I'm sure. But those were great too, because you could put anything in them as you were filling them up. And if you wanted to put more hops in there or more spices or whatever. One of the things I wanted to point out is there was a brewery called Firestone before Firestone Walker that was making a non-alcoholic beer back in the 80s. Groundbreaking stuff. Michael Lewis from UC Davis helped them with it. They were not affiliated with Firestone Walker, but they were from kind of the same area. And it was actually pretty good. So even non-alcoholic craft beer was a thing back then. It didn't last long, but it was there. And then that picture on the right is a picture of a bunch of craft brewers in California in the late 1980s gathering after a beer festival in Sacramento. And this was the origination of the California Craft Brewers Association, one of the first craft brewers guilds in the country. And that's me right there. So Charlie Papazian posted that picture, and I had to nick it. It's a great picture. So anyway, you know, as craft beer grew and brew pubs started opening up everywhere, we went into the 1990s, which is kind of where the trajectory was really, really amazing. And one of the people at the Brewers Association, or the Association of Brewers at the time, the organization out of Colorado, was David Edgar. And he used to always start his talks at the Craft Brewers Conference every year with craft beer sales are at an all-time high, and everybody clap and everything else. And it was true for a long time. You know, it was just growing so crazy. But the 90s is when, you know, IPA started to become a thing. You know, and hoppy beer started to become a thing. People started brewing more lagers. They started diving into Belgian styles and things like that. Barrel-aged beers started. You know, Goose Island and what was the brewery that Todd Ashman worked at? Flossmoor Station. And, you know, people started taking booze barrels and aging beer in them. You know, fruit beer came and went. You know, the blueberry, raspberry beer came and then kind of died. Red beer, you know, and I'll talk about that in a little bit. But, you know, red beer kind of came and went. You know, there also what was happening in the 90s was tap rooms were opening up. There weren't breweries, but they carried a lot of craft beer. You know, it was just big brewers were starting to take notice and starting to brew some beers. You know, the Association of Brewers started growing and becoming the organization for craft brewers. Also, what happened in the 90s was the internet, right? So, you know, it was an amazing time to share information and to learn. You didn't have to buy a book from England to learn about beer. You know, one of the excuse me, one of the other things that happened was Anheuser-Busch started going after craft brewers like Sam Adams that was contract brewing all their beer in big breweries. And there was a definite dislike between August Busch III and Jim Koch. And I was there for that. I was at Anheuser-Busch, and we'll talk about that in a minute. But, you know, Anheuser-Busch, you know, so Boston Beer started saying, yeah, our beer doesn't have preservatives, with the implication that the big American brewers use preservatives. They didn't. They used pasteurization. They didn't use preservatives. So, you know, the whole thing was Jim Koch was nasty about American beer, and August Busch didn't like it. He took offense at it and started putting out ads that criticized Sam Adams. There was a big Dateline thing on NBC where, you know, it was a who really brews your beer thing, and they dove in and really portrayed Sam Adams as a fraud for not having their own breweries at the time. And that really caused a downfall in craft beer in the late 1990s. It was ugly. I didn't like it at all. But, you know, back then, you know, craft brewers still banded together and really, you know, fought against contract brewing. You know, so beers like Sam Adams and Pete's Wicked Ale started taking a downturn because they didn't have their own breweries. But macro breweries, industrial breweries started squashing craft, started brewing, you know, craft-inspired beers, stealth craft. You know, craft versus crafty became a thing. You know, pasteurization was still looked at as evil by craft brewers. Boring, flavorless beer was something that we all fought against. You know, and then, you know, as we got more technical as craft brewers started looking at things like off flavors and diacetyl and things like that. Whereas in the 1980s, chances were 50-50. You go into a brewery and you get a diacetyl bond that tasted like butterscotch. And in the 90s, there started to be awareness about quality and managing quality much more than there had been. The Belgian styles that were brewed were not sours yet. But this is when people really started taking note of beer styles. And I worked for Anheuser-Busch at that time, and I spent over 4 years doing new product development. I learned more about beer styles in those 4 years than I ever learned before or after. It was an amazing time because Anheuser-Busch didn't know anything about it. And so I was the guy that was out there studying all this and putting presentations together and educating people at Anheuser-Busch. Here's some imagery from the 1990s. We talk about butter bombs, Red Hook ESB. That was a really diacetyl laden beer. But some of the big beers, Pete's Wicked was still popular. Henry Weinhardt's was really popular until they got bought by Miller. Sam Adams, that was when Sam Adams did the Triple Bock or whatever that was called. The big, starting to make these big, amazingly huge beers. Fat Tire from New Belgium. J.W. Dundee's Honey Brown. How many remember that? That was a huge beer for a long time. And then Coors and Miller started getting into doing these pseudo craft beers like the Miller Reserve Velvet Stout, which was actually a pretty good beer. But there was the big brewers were starting to notice and starting to get heat from the distributors for not having microbrew type beer offerings. And then there was the Miller Clear and the Zima kind of things going on as well. So in the 1990s, most of the 1990s, I worked for Anheuser-Busch. And like I said, I did 4 years as new product development. I worked in 3 different Anheuser-Busch breweries. The first one there is Fort Collins, Colorado, then St. Louis, and then the bottom right is Merrimack, New Hampshire, which they just closed, which was very sad. That was a beautiful brewery. But these are some of the beers I worked on. I was part of the specialty brewing group, which was their craft division. It was mostly marketing driven. We weren't like craft brewers telling people what they should be drinking. We were brewing what marketing told us to brew, which sucked. But we did come up with some good beers. And, we did a whole lineup of Michelob specialty beers. The best ones were the German Hefeweizen and the Porter and the Pilsner, which was good for a while until people at AB got involved and dumbed it down and made it another Budweiser. But we did a series of beers based on old-time pre-prohibition recipes from Anheuser-Busch. That was a fun project. We did a nitrogenated stout. We had a lot of fun with this. And I feel very privileged to have been able to do this in Anheuser-Busch. And then we started making things like tequila. And then that was the point where I said, okay, I'd rather make Budweiser, send me out to a brewery. And they sent me to Merrimack, and I made Budweiser for a few years. So I left Anheuser-Busch in 2006 because Stone had a job opening for a head brewer. And I debated over it. I wasn't looking to leave AB, but I was looking to get back into craft, and this seemed like a great opportunity, and it was. This is when craft beer, early 2000s through about 2015, when craft beer could do no wrong, right? And Kim Jordan from New Belgium used to preach that we'd be at 20% market share by 2020. We didn't quite get there. I think craft beer right now is about 11%. We kind of tailed off. But this was a time in the early 2000s where we could brew what we wanted to brew. We could tell people that our beer was great, and you've never had it before, so don't judge it. Try it. You're going to like it, and if you don't like it, drink something else. Beer styles became really important, and people became very, very focused on style guidelines. Working at Stone, we didn't typically follow style guidelines that much, so we didn't win a lot of awards. We won some, but we didn't win a lot. But, there were people that were really, we called them the style police, who would knock you if you used the wrong hop in a beer or whatever. But this is also when sour beers and wild fermentations and all this innovative stuff was happening. It was amazing. People were starting to discover obscure historical styles like Satis and things like that, and Goses, and trying to brew those. Nobody knew what those were until then. You know, nobody knew. Glassware mattered. The type of glass you were putting your beer in really mattered. Taking risks with beer, you could do that. And if it failed, you just moved on, right? Nobody held it against you. You tried something new and it didn't work. And I certainly had my failures at Stone, beers that just didn't quite work the way I had hoped. You know, and towards the end of my time at Stone, Greg Cook came to me and said, look, every beer you brew has to be a home run. And I'm like, what? You know, that was so against what we were all about. And I said, who decides whether it's a home run? And he said, well, it's kind of like porn. You know it when you see it. And I'm like, okay, I don't know about this. But, you know, we were all these breweries were in double-digit growth. They leveraged their growth. They borrowed money against their projected growth. They were growing like crazy. They were expanding across the country. It was an amazing time. Everybody was really optimistic. The industry, you know, Sam Calagione used to say the industry was 99% asshole-free. He was right. It was. You know, we thought we were going to change the world. Right. And it was an amazing time to be in craft beer. It was the funnest time I've ever had in my work life was this, because we could do anything we wanted. Creativity was rewarded. It was an amazing time. And we weren't worried about beer costs. We weren't worried about, you know, we had beers that lost money at Stone, but we knew the mainstay beers were going to make us the money to survive that. And it was a wonderful place to be. And we didn't have to really focus on beer costs and costs of ingredients. We could get ingredients, and, you know, if I got Australian malt and it cost us $2 a pound, so what? You know, and I did that, you know, and then, you know, for a one-off beer, we shipped over malt from Australia because we could, you know, and it was a wonderful time. So, you know, this was a time when quality programs started growing. International growth was a thing. People were shipping their beer to the UK, to Europe. Tax reform sponsored by the Brewers Association reduced the taxes on people that were making small quantities of beer, so that the taxes really weren't an impediment to growing your business. This was also the time when craft brewers started having relationships, good relationships with hop suppliers. And we started talking with hop farmers about what we wanted in their hops. And it was an amazing thing to have happen, because up until about 2010, Anheuser-Busch told hop farmers what to grow. Okay, big brewers told the hop farmers what they needed to grow. And so there was an organization called the Hop Quality Group that started, I think, in about 2010, 2011. And we went out to the hop farms every summer and visited with them and had barbecues with them and talked to them about what we were looking for. And as a result, the hop farmers started focusing on what craft brewers wanted, and it turned into an amazing thing. You know, the IBU arms race was happening then. Who could make the most bitter beer in the world? You know, people were advertising 1,000 IBUs, which is physically impossible to have in a beer. There is a solubility limit to isoalpha acids in beer. You can probably get 100 to 120 IBUs. So if anybody tells you they got more than that in their beer, they don't know what they're talking about. Also, this was the time when people started putting beer in craft beer in cans. And I remember when Oscar Blues started doing this, and everybody thought they were nuts. Now, the first craft brewer to put craft beer in cans was Peace Wicked Ale. And they did that for airline sales. And that was in the 1990s. But that didn't really take off, no pun intended. But the Oscar Blues thing was real. And that took off. And people thought they were crazy. And it turned into, now everything is in cans, right? But this was a time when brewers started really collaborating together and brewing beers together, which was a great part of the business. They started collaborating with musicians and rock bands. Started getting their beer into grocery store chains and convenience store chains. You know, the Association of Brewers merged with the Brewers Association of America to form the Brewers Association. The GABF and the Craft Brewers Conference became huge things. This was an amazing time in craft beer, and I'll never not look back on this with great memories. You know, we were all fighting macro brewers. We were fighting corporate cultures. When I got to Stone, if I wore a collared shirt, I got in trouble. It's like, what are you doing? If you wore Dockers to Stone, you just get, you just didn't do it. Using rice and corn you couldn't do it. Fizzy yellow beer was evil. Pasteurization was evil. Selling out was evil. I mean, it was a fun time to be in the business. And this was a time when we started getting specialized glasses for all our beers, and we stopped using the shaker pint Libby glasses. And we just thought everybody was gonna just embrace craft, and it was gonna become a permanent thing. And it has, to some extent. And I remember, our COO at Stone talking about, we want to have Stone beer in every grocery store in the United States and every convenience store in the United States. And I'm like, do we really? Do we really want that? I said, then it doesn't become special, and there's a certain thing about the rareness of beers, like who stands in line for Pliny the Younger every year. There's a rareness factor with craft beer that works, and to make it available to everybody might not be a good thing, but it was a great time to be a brewer for sure. And here's some images from that time. The Dale's Pale Ale in cans, the Russian River. You started getting sour beers, Jolly Pumpkin beers, and Founders Session IPA, and all these things were happening. The beer was just going like this. It was amazing time to be a brewer, and you could really exercise creativity. As most of these people were former home brewers, they were just embracing that innovation side of the business. And the Great American Beer Festival, that center bottom slide there, started drawing 30,000 people a year, right? And you go to Denver in October for the Great American Beer Festival, and there's nothing but beer everywhere. It was amazing. Now the Great American Beer Festival, they get 10 to 15,000 people. They're going to be lucky. But back then, it was crazy. And the Craft Brewers Conference, used to draw 10 to 12,000 people a year. And that happens once a year in the spring, and that's a trade show, and you'd have these huge brewery setups there, and you could buy equipment and everything else, and it was absolutely amazing. And during this time, I worked at Stone Brewing, and we grew from 35,000 barrels a year to 350,000 barrels a year in the 10 years I was there. We were in constant expansion mode. We built a new packaging warehouse, another 50,000 square foot building. We put a new lab in there with GC and all sorts of really sophisticated lab equipment and sensory equipment. We built a brewery in Richmond, Virginia. We built a brewery in Berlin, Germany. I mean, we were just going like gangbusters. And unfortunately, we leveraged all of that and got loans based on our growth, which was over 20% a year. Well, that went away, right? And so that's why Stone ended up having to sell and close down some locations. But the beer and music thing, that slide on the left there is Kerry Kelly, who is a guitar player that Greg knew really well and who's become a friend of mine. And he played with Alice Cooper for a number of years. He played with some LA hair bands, and he now is the guitar player in the band Night Ranger. And he had a couple of craft beer pubs in Las Vegas called Aces and Ales. And then he just opened up a brew pub in Las Vegas as well. And he's a really cool dude. And we got to play music and brew a beer together, which was really fun. We got recruited by the Brewers Association to write a book on India Pale Ale, which I talked a little bit about in the earlier talk, but that came out in 2012. Was out of date in 2013, but it was a great experience. And I got to brew some really cool beers, Ruination 10th Anniversary Triple IPA, Sublimely Self-Righteous Black IPA. It was a great time to be a brewer and a great time to be at Stone. But it wasn't meant to last, and we've gone into a period where craft brewing is struggling. And some people call it industry maturation, some people call it a crash. I think there's a lot of things that went into this. These quotes here are all about things that I've seen from what's been going on. COVID had a huge impact. The closing down of breweries and tap rooms for 6 to 8 months really destroyed a lot of breweries, and they never got their customer base back. I still think craft beer is all about community and relationships and face-to-face conversation, and that really took a hit. Diversity also became very important, and breweries that were misogynistic were being called out, right? And so a lot of breweries took a lot of heat and never recovered from that, and maybe rightfully so. Some of these people, if what was reported was true, acted horribly to people. But now we're all in survival mode, right? And we're trying to thrive in a very difficult situation. And a lot of breweries are closing. And I know you're seeing a lot of that here in Texas. We're seeing a lot of it in Georgia. And there's a lot of reasons for that. And we'll talk about that in a minute. But, I talked about, wanting to have Stone in every supermarket in the country. One of the things that killed the big regional breweries like Stone and Founders and some of these other breweries that were distributing nationally was that there were so many local small breweries popping up, and people wanted to buy the local stuff. And, why would you buy Stone in Atlanta, Georgia, if there were 4 people making a great IPA in Atlanta, Georgia that were local that you could support? And so a lot of the big breweries had to pull back and focus more on their localness and their regionalness. And, and that's a very real thing that impacted the industry. The other thing is breweries started running out of money. They started selling out. And, we started seeing that in the late 2010s. I think the one that hit me the hardest was Wicked Weed when they sold to Anheuser-Busch. I never thought I'd see that. I knew the guys at Wicked Weed. I loved their beers. I never thought they were going to sell out to Anheuser-Busch. But so many people sold out because they had to, or because they got an offer they couldn't refuse, honestly. And if somebody offers you $1 billion for your company and you'd be set for life and your family would be set for generations, would you turn it down out of principle? Probably not, right? I mean, that's just real. So it was a crazy thing that started to happen. And Anheuser-Busch and Miller Coors and all these, and a lot of foreign companies, a lot of Japanese breweries started buying craft brewers. And to their credit, some of them haven't changed. Some of the craft breweries in the United States haven't changed with new ownership, but a lot of them have. And a lot of them have been sold multiple times since then. And then some of the big breweries that I was fans of flat out closed. Iron Hill, 21st Amendment, Rogue, they're all gone. They're just completely gone. And that was just sad. Monster now owns Cigar City and Oscar Blues, and Tilray, which is a THC, a marijuana company, now owns Terrapin, and they own Sweetwater in Georgia, and they bought a whole bunch of small breweries from Anheuser-Busch, and who knows what they're doing with them. So it's it's one of those things that we're all kind of struggling with the reality of the situation. And the small breweries, there are still breweries that are growing, but a lot of breweries that either don't have access to customers through distribution, or poor business people, or have shitty locations. That's really playing a role right now. They're closing down. They just can't survive, and it's terrible. So, some of the things that are happening in the business right now, of course, hazy IPA is the big thing. That's the number one selling type of IPA right now, and it will be for a while, I think. The innovation shift was very real. We used to be able to brew what we wanted and tell people to drink it. Now we have to listen to the people that are coming into the tap room and brew what they want, which isn't what we want to brew. Honestly, they want IPA, they want light. They don't want to be challenged. They don't want to have their palates challenged like they used to. They tend to listen to what their friends want. And, it got to the point at New Realm where distributors were telling us what to brew and what not to brew. If we said, we're going to brew this beer, they said, we won't support that. We won't sell it. And so we wouldn't brew it. Couple of positives that have come out of this, though, is the resurgence of lager brewing. There's a lot of good craft brewers brewing great pilsners, brewing great lagers right now, which, 20 years ago, you wouldn't have seen. NA beers, And there's some other things that have happened that have been positives, you know, being extremely local, increasing your focus on the business out of necessity, but it's made us all better at what we do. You know, and at this point, you know, the enemy has changed. There's still a lot of camaraderie in craft beer, but the enemy's changed. Right now, there's a big push against the three-tier system. Now, three-tier system, distributors have politicians in their back pockets. So there's probably not going to be a heck of a lot that's happening there. But the fact that the distributors are refusing to carry small brewers, refusing to push beers that the brewers are passionate about, at some point that's going to backfire on them. I believe it. I just don't know how or when. But, you know, at some point, you know, the fact that the brewers or the distributors are only focusing on a couple of different types of beer styles, people will fight back against the homogenization of beer. The trend chasing, that's, you know, if you're brewing a beer just because somebody else is having luck with it, that's the wrong approach. You'll never beat them at their own game. And I've experienced that. You'll always be number two. If you want to be number two, great. You know, if you want to brew a tropical IPA because the best-selling beer in your state is a tropical IPA, that's great. But don't expect to overtake them when they've had a 5-year head start. You know, so that's bad business in my mind. Influencers, you know, go on about this all day, but these people that want money to come in and promote your beer, I hate it. I absolutely hate it. You know, an Untapped beer rating site is tough. It's tough because, and you've all seen this, you know, you get somebody who comes in and goes, well, I hate IPAs, but I got this and I'm going to give it 1 star because I hate IPAs. What the hell? You know, how's that helping anybody, right? But there's a lot of things going on: consolidations, buyouts, closures. Supply chain issues have been huge since COVID. Not being able to get ingredients skyrocketing. You know, the price of malt more than doubled during COVID. It's been brutal for breweries, and that's really creating a lot of problems for brewers and creating a lot of financial issues. And a lot of brewers are working their ass off trying to make it work, and they're burning out. And that's a very real thing. You know, if you go to the Craft Brewers Conference or some of these industry conferences, you're starting to see mental health booths because brewers are burning out. They're not making any money. People aren't buying their beer. They're losing their passion. It's a really tough situation. Some of the things that have happened that I think are kind of interesting is 22-ounce bottles. How many people see 22-ounce bottles anymore? That used to be the package of choice, you know, and it's gone. Belgian styles, extreme beers are a tough sell right now because people are buying light. You know, there's anti-alcohol factors contributing to that. You know, we're seeing people not cellar their beer anymore. Consumers, you know, beer drinkers, not having big beer cellars and not doing bottle shares anymore. I'm sure that's probably not the case with the people in this room, but but you know, it used to be a big thing, you know, where you'd have beer shares, bottle shares, and you know, I just don't see it happening that much anymore. I don't see beer dinners happening that much anymore. You know, the West Coast IPAs are coming back a little bit. IPA style variations are happening. You know, but, you know, when you can buy used equipment for cents on the dollar right now, that's killing the supplier industry, right? The equipment suppliers, they can't sell new equipment when there's 10 breweries up for auction every month. It's ridiculous. So there's a lot of things going on that are creating some real problems. One of the things I did want to mention is the American Homebrewers Association. How many of you are members of that group? That's great. They split off from the BA last year, right? So it's now a totally independent organization. I'm on the board for the BA, so I was part of the discussions around that. And the AHA people wanted to do that. So it wasn't like the BA was kicking them out or anything. And I wanted to clarify that. The AHA thought they'd be a better organization if they were self-governing and really try to get the people back to join the organizations. And I sat in on the talk earlier about homebrew clubs and trying to get, you know, people interested in homebrewing again and get the membership up. And I applaud you for that. You know, I'm a big believer in homebrewing. I was part of Brew Free or Die in New Hampshire. And I'm still a member, even though I don't live in New Hampshire. But that was 6 great years for me. I have made many friends that are still friends, and I brewed a lot of great beer in that organization. So I applaud you for keeping homebrewing going. It's a great thing. But, you know, this is what's going on in beer right now. It's a lot different than what it used to be. I worked with New Realm Brewing for 9 years. I left in September, and I've got a new job. I can't disclose where it is because they haven't announced it yet, but they'll announce it next week, I think. But, you know, you got the hazy IPAs, you've got non-alcoholic beers. Athletic has cornered the market on NA, craft IPA. You've got THC, all sorts of things going on. So, you know, it's and breweries are forced to brew things other than beer. Sometimes they want to do it, sometimes they don't. But, you know, I can tell you at New Realm, I had to brew RTDs, I had to brew seltzers, I had to make spirits, had to make THC drinks. Okay, none of those are beer. And, you know, we also made cider, you know, and you know, we had to do a lot of things just to keep people coming into our tap room. Much different audience than it used to be. I want to talk a little bit about COVID, and I know I'm running out of time. So if you need me to stop, just say the word. COVID was a killer. I mean, for so many people, everybody here knows what happened there. But specifically to the beer industry, one of the things we talk about a lot is the Generation Z. The people that were in college during COVID, and my daughter was one of them, lost out on the opportunity to learn how to socialize with alcohol. It's a big deal. It's a big deal. They don't know what it's like to go out and get drinks and strike up conversations with strangers in a pub and get to know people in a bar. They just don't. You know, and then the social media aspect where people are filming and taking pictures of everything they do. Young people don't want to be captured on camera getting drunk and stupid. It's the truth. And people have said that to me. You know, when we did it, nobody was taking pictures of us. We could get stupid and everybody'd forget it the next day, right? And you could move on with your life, you know. But it's a very real thing. You know, these people don't want to, you know, be dancing, you know, maniacally and get their picture taken because they're drunk. And it's a very real thing. So social media has had a real impact. The alcohol consumption downturn is very real. You know, THC, and I'll talk about this in a minute, it's a threat to the industry, to the beer industry. It's also an opportunity, depending on how you look at it and depending on what state you're in and whether it's legal or not. Dry January, sober October, those need to go away. Okay? You know, moderation all the time, right? I mean, you know, that's what to preach. You know, social drinking is great. Over drinking, you know, overconsumption is tough. But dry January helps nobody in the business. And one thing I will say is this year was the first year I heard people say that dry January was not as bad as it's been in the past. So hopefully it's on its way out. You know, California sober, smoking pot instead of drinking. That's a real thing. You know, what do you do about that? I don't know what the answer is, but, you know, and when people smoke pot or drink a THC beverage, they're not going to drink as much beer. That's a fact. So if you're stoned and you're in a bar with beer, instead of having 3, you're going to have 1. And that's proven. That's statistically proven. The people that really love craft beer, they're getting older. They don't drink as much. That's also a fact. You know, so people that could drink 6 beers in a night are not doing that every night anymore. You know, when you hit your 50s and 60s, it hits you harder the next day, and you just don't have the capacity to drink that much anymore. So people are drinking less. Young people are drinking less, which is a bad combination. Politics is a huge factor here. You know, you could talk about COVID, you could talk about tariffs, you could talk about rising prices and energy costs and the impact on ingredient costs that's having. All of that's very real. And if you go back to like World War I, when there were ingredient shortages, you see the alcohol content of beer made in Britain just drop like a rock because they couldn't make stronger beers. They couldn't get the ingredients to do that. That's happening now too. So, you know, the old business model where you could start a tap room and then go into distribution and do this and that, it doesn't work that way anymore. So you got to do, and I want to talk about some things you can do to be successful. So SWOT analysis, you know, if you look at strengths, weaknesses, opportunities, and threats to the beer business, I kind of laid this all out here. I'm not going to go through this, but I am making this presentation available so you can take a look at it. But this is just my take on it. You know, there's still a lot of strengths in craft beer. You know, the passion, the integrity, the legacy of craft beer, the government affairs work that the Brewers Association is doing to protect craft brewers, the camaraderie and collaboration are all very real. You know, but there are threats. You know, neo-prohibitionists are a real threat. Cannabis is a threat. Cannabis is also an opportunity. Like I said, if you decide to get into the business, the margin on THC drinks is a lot higher. You can make some money and then make beers you really want to make and not worry about losing money maybe. So anyway, that's SWOT analysis, and no need to go into that in kind of detail. Quality still matters, right? Quality was kind of not a thing until the 1990s, and then it became a thing. And I love this quote from Dan Carey, who runs New Glarus Brewery in Wisconsin. He said it at the start of a presentation one time. He said there are two types of brewers: those who have had a beer infection and those that haven't yet. It's a real, you know, you're going to get an infection. You got to learn how to deal with quality issues if you run a brewery. You can't just pass it off and say, well, this batch is a little bit different. You can't, you know, you got to learn how to dump your beer. You got to understand what quality means. You know, is it innovative beer? Not really. Consistency is part of it. If you're selling the same beer, you got to give people what they expect. If they have your IPA and it tastes different, then next time they buy it, they may not buy it again. You know, but having good brewing practices, sound brewing practices. And I think the educational materials over the past 20 years have gotten people there, where if you're brewing bad beer in a commercial brewery right now, that's on you. You know, that's not on anybody else. You know, and there are things you need to have from a quality standpoint if you're running a small craft brewery. The big thing here is quality does not end when your beer leaves the brewery. So if you're distributing, you should be out there tasting your beer in distribution, seeing how it ages, seeing how it pours, seeing how it tastes after sitting on a shelf, a room temperature shelf for 3 months. Business fundamentals are very important as well. And, you know, I'm not going to get into all this right now, but, you know, there's a lot of things you need to check as far as managing beer costs, shopping your suppliers, being flexible with ingredients and things like that. One of the biggest factors of closing breweries right now are people that got into leases and the landlords are raising their prices to make it completely unaffordable. Authenticity. This is something I hit hard all the time because I think it's so important. When you work for a brewery that's not authentically a craft brewery, you know it. Your customers know it. Beer drinkers know it. If you're just chasing trends and trying to do what everybody else is doing, people know that. If you're out there and you're creating beers that, you know, they may be popular styles, but if you're creating beers and putting your own spin on it, great. But lack of authenticity will kill a brand. You know, if you're not genuinely excited about the beers you're brewing, it'll kill your brand. Copying somebody else's beer, copying their marketing doesn't work. Like I said, if you're okay with being number 2, that's okay, but you're never going to overtake that number 1 beer unless something happens to that brewery. Trend chasing, people know you're doing it, you know, when you need to, not because you want to. So authenticity is really important. Staying apolitical is important. Don't take political sides. That's killed a lot of breweries. You know, try to stay neutral and that kind of thing, because politics doesn't, you know, it doesn't work. You know, 50% of the people are going to love what you say. 50% of the people are going to hate it. So just don't say anything. And I've seen breweries, you know, really take a very strong political stand, and then there's a huge backlash against it, no matter what side it is. You know, don't flaunt money. If you're a brewery owner and you're driving around in a Porsche, what kind of optic is that? Okay, when you're paying your people $15 an hour, it's not a good optic, right? And I'm not saying that brewery owners make a lot of money, because most of them don't, but some of them do. You know, and if you're not paying your people well, and your people can't afford, you know, don't have a living wage, and you're driving a really expensive car and taking all these trips, it's not a good look. And it's really important to be involved in the community. That's huge. So authenticity to me is one of the most critical things that brewers can focus on. And most craft brewers have authenticity. They started the business because they got into it because they were passionate about it. Innovation is still important. There's a lot of ways to be innovative right now. You know, you can be first to market with new ideas. You can be early to market, a fast follower. But if you start getting into the fast follower mode, then you start being perceived as a trend chaser. So, just be careful with that. Recipe formulation is not the biggest thing anymore. Marketing is very important. Storytelling still works. I still believe that if you can tell the story of your beer and why you think it's great, you're going to get more people drinking that beer than if you just put it out there. Reformulating beers never works. Okay. Unless, if you've had a beer that was very popular and is starting to slide, changing the recipe on that beer is not going to work. Okay. Now, if you start off with a beer and you don't like it and you change it and then it becomes popular, that's a different thing. But when you've got a dying brand, let it die. Come out with something new, and I learned that at Stone. We reformulated Stone IPA. We were told by our marketing team we had to modernize it, and Greg Cook bought into it, and we had to change it, and it didn't work. It didn't work at all. And we came out with another beer called Delicious IPA around the same time, and Delicious IPA grew, and that helped Stone IPA grow back. And Stone IPA has gone back to what it was. I don't think it's exactly the same as when I was brewing it, but it's a lot more like it used to be. Instead of having all sorts of tropical hops in it, now it's got, really good citrusy hops in it again. Pay attention to suppliers and their innovation, because that can help you with your innovation. And technology is amazing. Collaboration is still really great. The industry might not be 99% asshole free, but it's still largely asshole free. And the best part about this business is collaborating and having that camaraderie with other professional brewers. They'll help you. They'll help sell your beer. You help sell their beer. The rising tide still lifts all boats. So it's very, very important. And they can be fun. They can help build community, build authenticity. Collaboration beers are awesome. We did a lot of them at Stone. They kind of tailed off, and now people are starting to do them again. I talked about politics and impacting beer. This is the English standard gravity values, and you can see this is kind of a yearly average of gravity, original gravity numbers for beer, and this is in Plato or bricks or something. But you can see the big drop off in 1919, World War I. But you can see the gravities were dropping anyway. So after the war, it came back up, but still continued to drop. And that's largely due to taxation and politics. THC, like I said, it's an opportunity and a threat. It's a big deal. It's become quite normalized in the states that have it. Who knows what's going to happen on the federal level? Mitch McConnell and his farm bill in 2018 created the loophole that people took advantage of, and he hates that. And he tried to get rid of it to, protect his legacy with the bourbon industry. So there you go. But, is that ban on hemp beverages that's supposed to take place in November of 2026 going to happen? I don't know. I don't know if it will. This is billions of dollars in industry right now. It's hard to believe that the United States government would let those industries just go under. So, but if you're a brewer, you've got to do some things to make the product safe. You got to have a pasteurizer. It's a risky business to be in. Real quick, some of the things I think that are great about the beer industry right now is this kind of resurgence of traditional taproom experiences, whether it's Kolsch pours or slow pours that you can get up at Bierstadt, or cask tapping, or Czech Pils pours, or cask ales, things like that. You're starting to see those things kind of come back, and it's very authentic. The people that are doing it, they're putting a lot into it. So it's exciting times if you can find a place that's doing real cask beer and doing real German European lager service. Tap rooms are becoming more than just tap rooms. That's important for most breweries, making it an experience. Whether it's music or having kids playgrounds, or allowing dogs and having events and things like that. Tap rooms, you got to do more than just pour beer, right? And it could be a sports bar. You could have a heavy sports influence, which works really well in cities. The music thing works really great. So a lot of things you can do. Wrestling. My gosh, how many breweries in Georgia now host wrestling? on weekends. It's happening all over. It's crazy. And you know, in our place, we're located on a what's called the Beltline. It's a walking path that circles the entire city of Atlanta, and there's thousands of people that walk on this every day. And when we had the wrestling matches out there, it brought so many people in because they could hear the slamming of people on the mat, and they go, "What the hell is that?" And they run up there, and we'd be selling beer out there, and you know, they'd have the wrestlers parading through the crowd and staging fights in the crowd, and all. I mean, it's tremendous fun. So, you know, even though I think we bottomed out, I'd like to think we bottomed out. There's things that are happening that are positives. Correction was needed. Beer's always been somewhat cyclical. We're in a cycle right now. There's a lot of things that are going on that are unknowns, you know, with THC and prohibitionism and all that kind of stuff. But I think beer's coming back. You know, and it's interesting to see that Gen Z is actually spending as much money on alcohol as other generations. They're starting to learn how to socialize. They're starting to gravitate back to beer. We're seeing that. Craft is growing very fast internationally. If you go to South America, you go to parts of Europe, you go to Central America, craft is huge. So internationally, it's doing very well. Beer styles, certain, you know, the golden lagers, hoppy lagers are coming back. Guinness Stout is becoming a big beer again. You know, and we were talking about that last night. It's a beautiful beer. And, you know, Guinness ran out of stout, you know, last year. They had to do something. And, you know, it's just amazing. So, and there are success stories in these brutal economic conditions that are happening. Breweries can still be social anchors, family-friendly places to take your families. They can be sober-friendly places. You can have non-alcoholic products available for people that don't want to drink. And become an all-in-one weekend entertainment venue for a lot of people. So there's things that are positives. And I wanted to finish with this. Social drinking. You know, drinking's got a bad rap. Social drinking is one of the most wonderful things that humankind has ever done. And I believe that with all my heart. Social drinking is wonderful. It can enhance relationships. You build friendships. You make friends with people that last forever. You can find common ground if you don't agree on things. If you're having a beer, you can solve all the world's problems after 2 beers, right? And then you have that third one, you forget everything you came up with. But it's wonderful. You know, it's a fun beverage to drink. It's exciting. Enhances things like eating out and seeing music and seeing sporting events and being at parties. It reduces stress. It improves mood. You know, there's a great article here that I put a link to that's why my 2026 resolution is to start drinking again. And this was somebody that stopped drinking for a couple of years and found that his life was not better. And it was a very serious article. You know, it's like social drinking can really benefit your life. Overconsumption, not good. Social drinking, having a couple of beers with friends, you have a better life. And I honestly believe that. And I hope you do all too. So that's it for me. I appreciate your time. Hopefully you enjoyed this and have a great rest of the conference. This has been great.
Really appreciate